We're going to get started with our next session, which is focused on race. Continuing on with some of the data that we saw in the last one, and also going deeper with it. So behind me, I have Cheryl Phillips. She is the director of Big Local News at Stanford's Graduate School of Journalism. She also is the co-founder of the Stanford Open Policing Project. She is the former board president of IRE, and when she was at the Seattle Times until 2014, she worked on multiple Pulitzer-winning and Pulitzer finalist projects. Also behind me is Alain Stephens. He joins us from very far away, San Diego. He is the correspondent for The Trace, which is a newsroom dedicated to covering gun violence. He is a gun owner and a military veteran. He also was previously a reporter for the Texas Standard and NPR. And so they together are going to go through kind of all of the different places that we might see bias in policing, and also the media's effect on those stereotypes. So please join me in welcoming Alain and Cheryl.
It's really great to be here. I'm so glad that you are all in this room and working on this area of coverage. So important. So I have a whole slew of slides that I'm going to speed through. I can't promise I'm not going to get up and stand over there, but I'm going to try with the clicker and see how it goes. And what I'm going to try to do is talk through what we did with the Stanford Open Policing Project and talk through some of the terminology that we use and why we use it, when we use it, because one of the things that happens when you're covering policing is that it's easy to use words that may mean something other than what you intend. And so especially when you're talking about statistical analysis of police stops, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about, being precise is actually really critical. And so I'm going to talk through some of that. And then I'm going to talk about a few of the resources that are out there that can help you do kind of more contextual coverage of criminal justice and policing in your community. I'll add that one of the things that Big Local News does is we support local journalism, and we support local newsrooms in trying to provide data and tutorials and mentorship so that you can do these kinds of stories. Okay, so that photo is what happened when I came to Stanford. At the Seattle Times, I'd done a project into racial profiling by the State Patrol when I first got to the Seattle Times in the early 2000s. And so I knew that state patrols had police stop data and that was worthwhile looking at for possible stories. So I told my students, being somewhat naive as a college professor, I said, let's go get this data for the whole country. And that's what we got back, was folders and folders, manila folders full of CD-ROMs, of really antiquated software. And in fact, one agency sent us a CD-ROM that had a staple through it. That was fun. But we ended up, 18 students my first year, we ended up with like 60 million records from state patrols around the country. And at the end, we now have 250 million records. That's about to grow because we're about to update this. 33 states and 57 cities. We've just updated about a dozen cities that we'll be releasing the data on in the next few weeks. Those are the states where we kind of have coverage, where we kind of did. This says 100 million traffic stops. That's because we tried to make sure we were looking across the same time frame and that the data was good enough to analyze. And so we have the states, and then the red dots are the cities. What might come as no surprise is that black drivers are stopped more often than white drivers relative to their share of the population. So if you're doing a story on that, you might think, oh, this is a great finding. Well, it's not a great finding, it's a terrible finding, but it's newsworthy. We should write about this. But there's a real misnomer here, right? And that is that, like, if you're going to say that, how are you going to account for all of the people who are just driving through your town? Like, just looking at stops and comparing it and using the share of the population is not a great metric, because too many people just drive through, especially if you're talking about state patrol data, but even city level data. You don't know where that driving population came from. So it's not really the best metric, and it's not very precise. So we usually try to go beyond just the stop. It's not that that's not useful, but you have to use it with a lot of caveats. So we try to go beyond the stop, right, so that we can more accurately represent the population. And that is we go to searches. So, and then we look at searches, then we look at the results of those searches, which is sometimes called the outcome test. We built a new statistical test. I worked with a statistician and researcher at Stanford, Cheryl, who's now at Harvard, and we partnered on building this Stanford Open Policing project. So what happens is all my journalism students, they went out and got this data, and then I happened to meet Sharad, and I said, oh, I have all this data, and his eyes lit up, and he said, well, I have some statisticians. And I said, okay, we're off to the races. And the Knight Foundation gave us some money, and we built the Open Policing Project. So his researchers and Sharad built a thing called the threshold test, which basically, I'll go through in a minute, but it's a little more sophisticated test to figure out what is the bar that police officers have for searching white drivers compared to searching black drivers and compared to searching Hispanic drivers. And then the threshold test is a complicated statistical measurement, and it is somewhat hard to explain. But the veil of darkness test is a deceptively simple test and easy to explain and really clear. And so I'm going to walk through that, and because all of those are really useful for being able to tell stories out of this data and being able to accurately represent what's going on in policing in your community. So this is, I think this is the search rate one. I am going to get down and walk over here because I want to make sure I'm looking at the right slide. So yeah, this is our officers searching minority drivers on the basis of less evidence than white drivers, and the answer is yes, they are. And so we see that black and Hispanic drivers are searched on the basis of less evidence. That's that threshold test, and they're searched considerably more often than white drivers, and found with contraband less often. So that part of the test, like just looking at searches and this outcome test, sometimes called the hit rate, is a really easy one to do because basically your universe is the drivers, and we have the race and ethnicity of the drivers, and then we're looking at the really small subset, the percentage that are searched, and so we can have a good denominator, right? We know who our driving population is, and then we can say, hey, police officers search white drivers, stopped for the same thing, just regular speeding, 10% of the time, but they search black drivers, 20% of the time. And it's usually 2 to 3 times as often that they search black drivers. So that's the outcome test compared to the search rate, success rate across race groups. So like the next step of that is the hit rate piece of it, and that's when do they find contraband? So they search black drivers more often, and yet they find drugs or guns or some other contraband less often. They search them more, find less stuff. That, would you say, is discrimination? Do you think that's discrimination? How many people think that's discrimination? Raise your hand. You're all wrong. It's not. It's not discrimination. What is it? I know, everybody's looking at me, right? It's puzzled, right? Okay, so this is where we get to this terminology question. So there's disparities, what I've described about the differences in search rates and even the differences in stop rates, right? Those are disparities, they're differences. And then we have, but those disparities can happen for a lot of reasons. So, in fact, we were just talking about one. The Nashville Police Department had really, really high disparities, and we ended up doing a study with them. And they were searching minority drivers way more often than white drivers. And then that hit rate had that huge disparity. But were they actively going out and trying to discriminate against drivers of color? They were not. They were following a faulty policing model that they thought was good. And their faulty policing model was that they thought if they stopped drivers who had cars with equipment problems, they would reduce crime. And that's not true. If you stop cars that have broken taillights, you're not going to reduce crime. But that's what they believed. They were not trying to actively discriminate against drivers of color, or so they said. In fact, they contracted with our researchers, not me, to study that. And so they looked at all of their stop information, Cheryl Goel and his researchers, and said, look, stopping cars because they have equipment problems is not going to reduce crime. Let me show you this statistically. And they did. And the Nashville PD said, oh, we were wrong. We're not going to make any more equipment violation stops. Guess what happened to their disparities? Plummeted, right? They have much better it's much more equitable now across the race and ethnicities. Not completely gone away, sadly, right? But that was not all discrimination. That was just following the model, however well-intentioned or misinformed, but they were not actively trying to discriminate. It's just that they had a disparate impact. The disparities had a disparate impact upon different populations. So,
passively discriminating.
So
they were passively discriminating.
Well, that's the thing, you can't passively discriminate. You can have a disparate impact. So then these words are actually really important because they mean different things. So you can say that they had a disparate impact, but I wouldn't say that they're discriminating. There are cases where we see evidence of discrimination, and what's the difference? It's when you can rule out these other things. So like when we were looking at our search and hit rate universe, we took out equipment violation stops. Let's just talk about places where police officers don't have a lot of choice. If they're X number of miles over the speed limit, or if it's a speeding ticket and they're being dispatched to stop speeders, they're unlikely to be able to see the race of the driver when they're going by at 70 or 80 or 90 miles an hour. They go after them, and then do we see differences, right? And so, and then if you're still seeing differences at the search and the hit rate, then that could be because once they stop them, there is some subtle evidence of bias or discrimination happening. And then that's when you really want to dig into, is there actual discrimination happening? But you've got to filter out all of these other things that can muddy the water. So, and the reason you want to filter it out is because you want to be you all know this, but we want to be as accurate as we can, because if we're going to affect change, then you want to be able to have your analysis bulletproof so that the police department can't come back to you and say, oh, well, you forgot to look at this thing. No, we looked at all of these things and we still see disparate impact and evidence of bias. Yeah?
So couldn't the model, though, be discriminatory based on class, not on race? Because if you're singling out people who potentially maybe couldn't afford to fix their car, then aren't you picking on people who potentially are of a lower class? And you're then predisposing those people to be...
Yeah, right. It gets really muddy. It's really hard to tease out. Was it the fact that they were low income and they couldn't afford to fix the taillight? Or is it because they were black? Because what happens is a lot of low income folks are also people of color. So, it gets very muddy. It's hard to tease that apart. So there are some ways to look at this data that will help illuminate rather than muddy. And so I'm going to talk about those really quickly. I'm going to skip past, we already talked about the outcome test. So the threshold test, if you use the threshold test, we actually have a tutorial on how to use it. I will tell you right now, don't do it by yourself. Find a statistician to help you. If you use the threshold test, what does it do? It just says, hey, if I stop a white person, what's it going to take for me to decide I want to search that person? If I stop a black person, what's it going to take for me to decide to search that person? And what we found by looking at both the search rate and the hit rate, kind of in correlation with each other, was that on average, across the country, in every jurisdiction that we have studied, everywhere, officers, on average, will search a black person more easily than they will a white person. They'll just have a lower bar, a lower threshold. Now, is that evidence of discrimination? Yes, that is evidence of discrimination, right? Because everything else being equal, same type of infractions, same type of everything, they just say, oh, for whatever reason, my own internal biases, you look more sketchy than you, even though everything else was exactly the same. That's evidence of discrimination. The problem with this test, the threshold test, is that it is hard to explain. It's a statistical test. It's complicated to run. Can do it. The LA Times did it in consultation with us. And then the LAPD changed their policing policy, like I think the next week, but they'd been hitting at them for a while with a whole bunch of stories. So you can actually do really good journalism out of it, but it's kind of going to take you a little bit of time, right? So there's another test that I actually really recommend, and it's called the Veil of Darkness test. I like this test because it's pretty simple. Basically, we took geographic locations across the country and used daylight savings time to be able to control for time of day and before and after sunset. So the baseline of this is if you stop, what happens is that black drivers, like driving along, they get stopped at a kind of maybe even a comparable rate, but as white drivers in some cases, and you think, okay, no problem, except that then the sun sets and guess what happens? The police officer can no longer see the race of the person because the sun has set and the rate of stops of black drivers goes down. So they get stopped less often after dark than before dark. So like that's a little chart of that. This is I'm not sure if the play button's gonna work, but we did a little video of this that basically shows that like after the sun sets, then the number of black people who are getting stopped just drops. So that is another evidence of discrimination test. Pretty easy to explain, right? And pretty easy to run. The main thing with this one is you just have to have a lot of data points, which in most cases, if you're going far enough back in time, you do, as long as it's not a really tiny town. And we have a tutorial on how to do it, and we will help people run it. So if you were like, hey, I'd really like to look at police stops in my area, even if you don't have the data yet and you want to go get it, one, we help people negotiate for data, but two, we would help you figure out how to run that test. I do it all the time with journalism outlets. So we initially released our data in 2017, and in fact, we've trained over 200 journalists. We did big, huge training workshops at IRE and NICAR, and Pointer did one. We did some with Pointer in Chicago. And basically, we just work with news organizations to help them tell these stories in a way that will get across what's going on in your community. So NBC did a story, The Economist did a story, HuffPost, just you name it, and we saw changes. So a lot of places like Cleveland, I can't remember who did it in Cleveland, but I think it was either Cleveland or Cincinnati. They did a story about police stops. The very next week, the city council decided to stop doing equipment violation stops. The Investigate West did a piece about stops around Native American reservations and the disparities and evidence of discrimination there. And so this is, the state where I had done my initial project, was so glad that they went back and did this. And because in the intervening years, in 2008 and 2009, when we were in the Great Recession, the state legislature decided to stop funding the analysis of this data. And so then as a result of the Investigate West project, they started analyzing it again and using it to inform their policing practices. So you can see real impact if you do these kinds of stories because you've got the evidence right there. This was the LAPD story that led to kind of the change in policy on equipment violation stops there. And this was the one from Investigate West. This is the one in Ohio. So you can have, these stories can take anywhere from, if it's just basic analysis, looking at the hit rate and the search outcomes and things like that, that doesn't take very long to do. You could probably do it in a couple of weeks. If you really want to do the Veil of Darkness test, it might take a month or so, especially if you want to go out and interview people and really get some good information. But you can get some real impact out of them. So all of that data is at our website, the Stanford Open Policing Project, along with the tutorials. And you can actually practice in analyzing the data, and if you hit a roadblock, you can check with us. And as I said, we're about to update some of the cities. It's a hard project to update regularly because it took us a while to even get this data, but we are kind of continuing to pick away at it. So one of the things that I like to think about, though, is just don't assume discrimination immediately, right? It just may be differences in stops, and it may be for a variety of reasons. So look for the disparities, look for the disparate impact, where one group is impacted more than another, and then examine whether bias could be at play, where you can do something like the veil of darkness test. And then think about expanding beyond police stops, right? More organizations are sharing data along with stories. I'm working with 20 newsrooms across the country right now to collect police certification and decertification data across the country, every state where we can get it. And we're getting historical data from previous news organizations like USA Today that have already done some of these projects, and they're sharing that data back with us. So the whole idea is that we can collect this data and then make it usable for newsrooms anywhere to use it, so that you can maybe track a police officer who's moved from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? And we are really interested in working in collaborative efforts with news outlets. I'm working with CBS right now, for example, and ABC. So, yeah, just there's a lot of data out there. Of course, there's the fatal force data set as well. And one of the things that we do on the Big Local News site is we have a data sharing platform. You can log in, it doesn't cost you anything, and there are data sets there that you can download. Beyond policing, but we have, of course, policing data there. We are also pulling in a lot of other like court settlement data. And in California, we're part of the California Reporting Project, which is looking at all of the police misconduct and use of force records, where 40 newsrooms across the state are collecting and trying to process all of these documents, police cameras, body cams, all of that information, and do stories out of it. And I regularly use students both at Stanford and in partnership with Berkeley and in partnership with news organizations and local journalists to try to tell stories out of this. We did a story about Bakersfield police, breaking 31 bones over 4 years, right? We did that out of that data. And our goal is to eventually have a public-facing set of data that is releasable. So there are a lot of resources for finding data and documents that will help you do your policing. For example, 911 and 311 calls. Really interesting thing in San Francisco, if you look at their 311 calls, they call about abandoned vehicles. And what we find is that those abandoned vehicles actually have license plates attached to them, and we can watch them move around the city depending on the day. So the police officer goes out, says, this is an abandoned vehicle, get it off the street. And the homeless person who's living in the unhoused person who's living in that vehicle moves it 3 blocks over until the cop comes over there and makes him move again. That's a pretty good policing story. Why is that their solution to the problem in San Francisco, to make the cars move from block to block to block? And you can actually see it happen by looking at the 311 data. Like, that's a great thing you could look at just in any community. And that kind of data is almost always up on their open repositories, and if not, really easy to request. Court settlement data, all of my students every quarter get an assignment to go after court settlement data from jurisdictions across California and also in other cities across the US. And we're putting that up on Big Local News so that settlement data is available for folks. And again, I mentioned the police misconduct and use of force records. There's also survey data from 3,500 local law enforcement agencies that you can access. And there's the National Archive of Criminal Justice data, as well as audits of police agencies from the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. We actually have a news bot that tracks all the problematic audits if you get federal money at like $650,000 or more. Then you have to turn in an audit every year, and all of the problematic audits we extract back out of this audit database, and we have like a little news bot that just flags people. Like, oh, hey, this is they misspent their money here. And like just looking at police agencies would be interesting for that. So I'm showing all of these really quickly because this deck can be available for you all so that you can kind of click on the links and explore the data sets. But these are just kind of some of the resources for finding data. This is the story about the Bakersfield police. And then we also did another one about 7 police dog bites that we did in Berkeley Investigative Reporting Program, and that kind of dovetailed off of, I know Carol Bogert was here earlier or last night, and that dovetailed off of some of the work that the Marshall Project has done. So we're trying to make progress on policing records. Today, New York and California now make disciplinary records a matter of public record, and other states are changing as well. So the more they change, the more we try to go after those records and then turn it around, make it available to journalists to tell stories, because I'm a local journalist, that's where I came from, that's what I want to do. There's a lot of other possible stories you can do. Reporting on red light cameras is an example. There's this one story that was done about how police officers were spending a minute, this was in San Diego, or 2 seconds to review a police stop at a red light camera violation. It's there's no way somebody can say that was an actual violation with a 1 second look at a camera. That's a good story. You could do that probably pretty much in any jurisdiction. Looking at what's happening with license plate readers and if people are looking those up when they shouldn't be, for example, is another story you can kind of think about. So those are just, I guess, some quick thoughts on how to use terminology when you're looking at this data, and then also just some of the resources that are out there to find this data and to be able to turn the data into stories with impact. So that's my spiel.
Let's see. So let me reintroduce myself. I'm Alain Stephens. I'm an investigative reporter for The Trace. We're a nonprofit that covers gun violence across the country. Before I was a journalist, I was a 2-branch military vet, and I have a little bit of a secret weapon here. I was an ex-cop. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we get wrong when it comes to criminal justice reporting. And initially, when I got this mission, we were talking about stereotypes. And I was going to come up here as a person of color and say, look at all these problematic depictions of people of color. Stop doing it. But as I chewed on this mission, like so much things with race and crime in society, I realized that this is a little bit less on us, more on y'all. And what I mean by that is the white-centric gaze in which journalism is often viewed. And that is why we are often blind to some of these issues and the magnitude in which they affect our society. And so hopefully, if I could shift some of this subjectivity, this white subjectivity, and get you guys grounded into the scale of the problem that we're looking at, you won't put your foot in your mouth so easily. Because we do it all the time. And so the first thing I see when it comes to making mistakes about crime, police, and race reporting is, one, we're still very centered in whiteness. So everything here, by the time you guys hit lunch, you guys have heard in excruciating detail what the criminal justice system is doing to this country, right? I mean, look at it. Let's just we're the most incarcerated nation in the developed world. 1980 to 2015, 500,000 to 2.2 million increase in the prison population, right? If we saw this and we were international reporters, this is apartheid in action in real time. This is the Uyghur incarceration in China. This is the troubles in Ireland. But it's never hardly centered in half of our news reporting, right? We just kind of ignore it. And here's where we get into this major problem, okay? Because it would already be bad enough if this was happening on the scale to all Americans. But we know that it's happening to a targeted set. And so when we go out here and we ignore this problem, right, in any of our stories, if this is not front and center, at the very least, right, you are white-centric because you're ignoring, right, the voices and the damages of other Americans in your country. And at the very worst, it's white supremacists because you're saying that the status quo is okay. We are journalists here, and I've been in so many of these panels where we talk about what's happening to essentially the people that look like me. And we're sitting here, and I go and I turn on the TV, and we're talking about stories of how police are meeting with black fathers for donuts and coffee, as if a pastry can bridge the gap between policy and violence, right? They're like, we can't do anything about that, but we can give you a Dunkin' Donut. All right, so when we report, if that is not centered, right, in most of your crime reporting, you're already out the gate liable to start making mistakes through sheer ignorance, right? There are black people, right, brown people who have loved ones who've been killed, incarcerated, or simply terrorized by the criminal justice system. Me as a black man, right? I think you guys hear knocks on your door at night, and you're like, is that a burglar? I hear knocks on the door, I have to say, is that a burglar, or is that a SWAT team who come here and kill me? And nothing will happen. That is my reality. That is a terror that is often immeasured and not ever captured in news. And I've done nothing wrong, I'm not a criminal or anything. But that's a fear that we have to walk with. The other reason is you fail to understand the police. We often go to the police so much, and one of the things I need to tell you from the inside is that the police are in an existential crisis. And we don't report on them like that, right? We report on them like they're the power company, right? Or some business down the street. Police, when I say they're in an existential crisis, their literal existence is being challenged right now, talking about should they exist in society? Should we defund them? When they make mistakes, it's not like, oh, you know, we messed up our little whatever here. People didn't get power to their homes. Cops are going to prison. People are dying. Life and liberty and property is having to be handed back to people. Millions of dollars of our money, taxpayer dollars, is being handed out in settlements all the time. And here's the thing. They know that. They seem to know that more than us. A lot of well-funded police departments have actually gone out and hired public relation firms to talk to us. They're using taxpayer dollars, right, to essentially tell their narrative and defend themselves against the public from the taxpayers. And the other thing is that one of the reasons why we have a tendency, right, to focus so much on the police, right, over the community, is that the police proximately stand closer to whiteness as an organization than the community. Just keeping it real. And this has been borne out through you could look at the Lyndon B. Johnson, Kerner Commission reports from the 1960s after race rights. They say it back then in the 60s. So this is all just kind of cyclically happening over and over again, right? And it's just been borne out that we have a tendency to trust that uniform over the pain and terror of these other communities, right? And the other thing that we also have a problem with is that police are very excited to kind of step in this position as the monopoly on criminal justice. There's a sociologist named Michael Sierra Ravelo. He's from University of Texas, and he's really studied police culture. And one of the things he talks about is the fact that over the years, the government, society, and media has been very willing to give police, again, the monopoly of being experts on crime. We let them speak out of turn many times on a system that, first of all, they were never built to capture this data, research, information at all. The end. They're just not built, they're not researchers. I've been on the inside. We are trying to pull this data off of them, and we are having to do the analysis because it's not really captured for that. This is their government documents for their processes and practices, okay? These policy, recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. But I just want to let you know that when it comes to what they are trained to do, what you learn in the police academy, is essentially the front-loaded portion of the criminal justice system. So police really don't understand things like recidivism. They don't, if you get arrested by a cop, they really can't tell you what's going to happen to you, right, in the criminal justice system. Because they don't know, that's not their part of it. But they are very quick to run into the media, right, and tell us these grand scale, things. And I'm going to tell you another thing. I've interviewed a lot of police chiefs, and they know that I know their information, right? I can code switch on a law enforcement level with them. But here's the thing. I've presented a magnitude of problems, and they will always say the same thing. They need more cops, they need more money. The end. It's just like gravity, okay? And that's their job, right? If someone came to us as journalists and said, what do you guys need to do to cover this better? More journalists, more money, more data, right? And so we have to get smart on that and understand that the cops are always going to advocate on behalf of the cops. And it's not our job to advocate for them, it's our job to advocate for the community first. Sometimes there's a synergy in that. Sometimes you're going to meet a law enforcement agency and there's going to be a community and you as a journalist and everything's going to work together and we all need to get that story out. But in the current state of affairs that we're seeing right now, where people are causing hundreds of millions of dollars of damage for one failed policing action, right, at a time, right? We need to know that they know that the spotlight is on them and they're doing everything in their power to defend themselves, okay? The other thing we do is even with knowing all this, we stereotype, right? And I want to talk about stereotypes in a way because I think we think stereotypes are just, like I said, problematic depictions of people, the problematic and shallow depictions of not only people, but problems and systems, right? And one of the things that we do is, even though we know all of these things, right, we have a tendency to just be rushed because we're feeding the machine. One of the things that you look at is when you see these stereotypes, it's often simply cyclical narratives that are often borrowed from other news agencies or borrowed from reporting of the past. And so because we're rushing, right, we have a tendency to rush and grab the same type of narrative. And they end up being spun over and over again. So one of the things is that when it comes to criminal justice reporting, half the time we just need to stop and think, right? And I think that's worth it because from all the data we've heard before, the stakes are so high, right? Right? This is we're kind of at war level reporting here because people are dying, people are losing their life and property. One of the things that we also fail is that we don't focus on the end effect. We talk about how, this really kind of stems a lot of the time because we focus on police, right? And we need to understand that police they're very much kind of the entry point, right, of when someone enters into the criminal justice system. And so many times our reporting starts with the police say they're going to roll out this program. There's a new law enforcement initiative. And we never come back to see, did the charges even stick? Right? There's stories coming out here now that's like we've gone out and reported on people and they've gotten arrested and they put dope on the table and come to find out a year later these people were innocent and we never cleared their names. Right? And we just let that out there. Writing these stories that these cops are really successful, right? Getting a whole lot of drug dealers, a whole lot of bad guys off the street and everyone went home and they wasted taxpayer dollars. The other thing that we need to find out is just this right here, is that the criminal justice system is bogged down mostly, and I wanted to remind you guys this, when you see all these felony cases come in through your emails, right, through district attorneys and stuff like that, so still the majority of the cases that we're focusing on is misdemeanors and non-violent offenses, right? And so when you see these types of rollouts of these expensive programs, y'all need to have this in mind, right? That this is not really facing the majority of the people that are entering into this system, okay? The other thing that I mentioned as well is just the sheer terror. I think we just don't capture that, right? The lifestyles of Black and brown Americans who don't even enter the criminal justice system at all. I think one of the things that white people in this country don't really understand is that this affects how we move and breathe in our society. Like all the stuff we talked about getting pulled over, right? Like the veil of darkness. Did you know that there are Black people who are probably driving at night because they feel safer? Y'all should be ashamed of this. This is bad, okay? And so,
you know, the Bakersfield story that I talked about,
yeah.
There was a guy on a bicycle just riding his bike, but it was dusk. Police officer saw him, thought he looked suspicious, chased him. Guy rides his bicycle to try to get away from him because he's being chased, hadn't done anything wrong. Police officer catches him and pulls out his baton and breaks his leg. There were no charges filed, and there was no discipline meted out to that officer. Any of the officers, out of all of those 31 bones that were broken, no discipline, not any.
Yeah, and then, like I said, half the time, like we talk about that initial, like there's an arrest, someone got tackled, we walk away from that piece, but we don't talk about that there's nothing happened. There's nothing happened. That's accountability right there. We leave it on the table. And so what happens is that, and this is my favorite part, right? Because as a news media industry, I think we kind of miss this, right? When you report a reality that is not true, okay? And there's a segment of the population that turns on the TV and your perception of the police is like, you know, pink, green, and whatever, and they walk outside their window and their reality is gray, you look dumb. And they're gonna stop watching the news. And this, again, has been borne out through reports. That as a Black person, if I turn on and see constant depictions of police in a light that does not match what I experience, right, you are discredited. So this is why we have to get this right. We don't report root causes. Again, because we are so police-centric, we have a tendency to focus on when the person first interacts with the criminal justice system, when the police officer first captures them. And because of that, police often front like, hey, we know how to stop this. But as we've been told before, that we know that poverty and economics and location, even weather can affect, right, who and why people are going out and committing crimes. I had this editor one time, I was doing this story, and I didn't even get a chance to do it, I was pitching it. And it was, I got a bunch of data on state and federal wiretaps, and it showed that so many people, essentially so many federal agencies are running these taps, and they're spending all of this money, and most of them never went to arrest. Just running wires on people and nothing ever happening, right? And so I came up to this editor and I said, hey, we should talk about this. And they said, why? Most of these people are guilty anyway. They're here in San Diego, so not in the room, but they out here. And so one of the things that I think is a problem when we don't report on root causes is we have this ability to kind of throw away the criminal as worthless. That people commit crimes because they're just stupid and they're bad people and first of all, knowing what we know that this is mostly a misdemeanor machine, you can't say all these people are bad because most of these are minor, non-serious offenses. But the other thing though too is without focusing on the root causes, you kind of write this American criminal justice system that all these people here are doing this are stupid. And that's not true. I have interviewed people who are very pragmatic and, to be honest, have had some very interesting stories that led them to committing illegal activity, right? The other thing too is that when we miss some of these root causes, right, like we kind of oversimplify the crime problem. I'll give you an example right here, okay? So we talk about immigration, right? We talk about people moving over to the country and they're like, should we let them in? And Border Patrol, that's a law enforcement situation, all right? But 180,000 people have died over the last 20 years in a Mexican drug war. When I get documents from Mexico, I have to get it from their military because that who has to fight their war there, okay? When I get those documents, and our own government has said this, right? 70%, and they think it could be more, of the weapons that are being recovered at crime scenes in Mexico are originated where? Here, in the United States, okay? And this is our own government tracking this back down because we have good communications, right, with the Mexican government. And so we talk about this, we kind of place this thing as immigration and the people coming here to this country are opportunists, but the reality is that they're war refugee. This is war refugee displacement, and it's being fueled by American guns and American money. And that is a law enforcement story because we do have a border patrol, and within their jurisdiction is not only the northbound flow of people and drugs, but the southbound flow of weapons and money. They're not doing their jobs, guys. We have to frame root causes. Without framing root causes, we as journalists, as the askers, cannot ask for a better society. The other problem is that we still value cis white victims more than others, right? When it comes to actual crime victims, people who are hurt from criminals, right, we really don't treat those equitably. I still see a lot of Gabby Petito cases out here. I'm just putting names out here. We see a lot of that. And the reality is that we keep on seeing these studies over and over again, right? That if we know law enforcement, and I think we need to kind of put this in perspective, we know law enforcement, right, targets criminality based on race. Why do we not think that they would ignore that same racial factor when it comes to the energy that they dedicate to finding justice for victims? And we see it out too, right? So I'll just let these stand here. Y'all can read this. I'm going to use another example here of how we get a lot of this wrong, and it's in mass shootings. I see all the time. So I cover gun violence. I cover it every day, 365 days. 111 people die every day from getting shot. And the only time anyone calls me on NPR or anything like that is when there's a mass shooting. And the reason why, right, even though you and I and everyone in this room are more likely to be killed with a handgun, probably by someone we know, and what would be considered petty street violence, right? The reason why I am called and the reason why the national conversation is led around AR-15s and mass shootings is because they have a tendency to hit white habitats. And we know that white victims are held at a higher esteem than everyone else. The majority of people that die from guns look like me. They're black men. The other reason we fail is because, and I'm just gonna keep it real, right? We keep on walking into stereotypes about race, crime, and society because our industry is still overwhelmingly white. We're trying to fit the circle peg into the square hole. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who was pretty much explicitly racist running the FBI, knew that to infiltrate the Black Panthers, you're gonna have to hire some black people. If you're a CIA, you're trying to infiltrate Iran, you're gonna have to hire some Iranians. Only in journalism, right, would a bunch of white people look at a city like Houston or Detroit and say, we got this. We got every speck of this covered. One of the reasons we keep on having these panels and these things here, right, and white people keep on coming up saying, how do we infiltrate this? How do we digest this? How do we put stakes in this, right? And part of it is playing catch up to us. Hire us. Put us on your team. We will have a raw edge on this. And when I say diversifying, I don't mean diversifying in just race. Hire some people who have some military background, who come from middle America. Hire people who come from a poor factory background. Hire people who had international reporting backgrounds. Hire people who've just been around some guns, been around some violence. They're gonna help you in this violent space. The other thing that we also need to find, because I've been having a lot of these discussions, is that we keep on thinking that this whole thing, race, crime, all of this is an addendum, right? That we've already written the journalism book in the industry, and now we're just gonna try to add this little chapter. You guys remember in the yearbooks in high school, and then be like, we got that little last part, we're just gonna wedge that in here? We can't do that, right? I was talking to a California Attorney General, Javier Becerra. I think he went on to Department of Homeland Security or something like that, but it was post George Floyd, right? And anyway, he was like, yo, like, saying the same stuff that cops always do. I was like, hey, how can you guys stop, beating up black people and doing predatory traffic stops and stuff? And he was like, I'll tell you what we need is we need more cops. We need more money and stuff. And I hit him with the journalism thing, and I said, listen, I'm tired of this. Because you guys have a lot of resources, and we have to kind of back ask that question into this, right? Which is, you had the resources, but you decided to spend them on something else. If we want to get this right, sometimes we have to stop the wars that we've been fighting, go back to the drawing board, and figure out what's important to us. There are certain sections of the news, there are certain news industry structures that we're gonna have to get rid of because we're going to have to focus, right, on some of these major problems that are tearing up our country, right? I think it's like silly today, but I remember, right, a little bit ago when everyone was burning down Targets and my phone was exploding, right? And we're all trying to play catch up. And so right now we know, right, that this is a leading issue and this can happen again. And it's happened before, right? We've seen Watts riots, we've seen Rodney King riots. When it comes to race and police riots, like we on our 17th, 18th one, we good at it, we professionals at it, okay? And so to prevent this stuff from happening again, okay, we're going to have to start taking this as media, as the fourth estate, a little bit more seriously. And that may mean restructuring, thinking about this as a prime topic. When you look at the opioid epidemic, it was nonstop coverage until we got done, okay? Right? When we looked at the Catholic Church, it was coverage until we got it done. Only, it seems, in crime and policing and gun violence, we're here for the moment and we're gone when it doesn't suit us. Stop it. Yeah, sometimes the easiest solution is the simplest. You get what you pay for. And so sometimes it's just like, yo, if you look outside and you're like, hey, we're struggling with this, this is for the editors. This is for the publishers, right? I kind of, I have all these reporters come to me and they're like, yeah, we want to do this. The reporters, we know what we need to do, okay? But now I'm kind of talking to the editors, I'm talking to the publishers, because I'm like, listen, you get what you pay for, and we got to start paying for more. And that's it. We get this stuff right, we'll be doing another panel. It'll be a better panel. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. I'm sorry I got heated on that. It's very important to me. So.
Now I think we get to answer questions.
Yeah, any questions?
Yeah.
When you were talking about the stereotypes that you see as perpetuate, can you give us examples of what you think the most prevalent ones are there that we have to overcome?
Yeah, I think the police as experts is probably the #1 stereotype. Everyone out here is portraying the police as if, it's SVU. Stop writing for Dick Wolf. Like, that's not what we do. First of all, right, just look at the educational history of our police departments, right? The way they promote, the way they hire, the way they train. There's a lot of chiefs out there walking, and this is no slight on them, but there's a lot of chiefs out there walking around on University of Phoenix degrees. And they're out here talking about national policy recommendations on crime in major cities. They're out here trying to talk about race and sociology and stuff, and they're just not from that. And so I think probably that's always the #2 slide in that, is there's just this tendency for us to run to the police chiefs and say, well, what are we supposed to do? And they have used that as a very strong or advocacy platform to get MRAPs, to get tanks. I'm just gonna tell you a story right now. There was a cable news show that came to me. They haven't done it yet. I hope they ain't up in here. That was like, listen, hey, we're gonna do this thing on guns, right? Gun violence. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna highlight how these policymakers, right, that the main policymakers who are very pro-gun, right, are also pro-law enforcement. And we wanna say, like, but isn't law enforcement, one of the #1 victims of these guns, right? That they're the ones who are gonna get shot. Pretty smart take. They're trying to get involved. They're trying to get in the mix. And I said, yeah, this is all interesting and true, but what you're going to do is you're going to do this story, and what you're going to be printing is currency for that law enforcement department to take that to their city council and get body armor and MRAPs and plate armor. And here's the thing, they've done this before, right? One of the reasons why we're talking about combing through all this data and how hard it is to get is a lot of this is post 9/11 garbage. And we kind of walked ourselves into this as journalists by saying, law enforcement is really struggling with X, Y, and Z. I mean, when we look at 3 strikes laws, we wrote ourselves into that. We can go back through our journalism history. I've actually did a story that was an opposite story. There's a 10-year later story where I was talking about how there's a 14-year-old in Texas who was defending his brother in a fight and got a 99-year sentence, right? And it's just like appalling. Everyone's like, this is a de facto life sentence on a child. And the previous reporting on that was, do the crime, do the time, send them away, and that. And so, yeah, we see this stuff. And so I think we as journalists try to absolve ourselves, particularly historically, from our problematic takes. But no, we've written ourselves, and I think we've written a lot of white hat cop stories that have made them almost impugn to accountability, and we're paying the price for that to this day.
Let me add one thing. The one thing you can do in your newsrooms right away is go get the training manuals that your police agencies use. And then when an incident happens, check what the training manual says a police agency is supposed to do in that kind of situation, and ask if they did it. And look at their narrative, look at their police report of the incident, and say, does that match up with what they're supposed to do according to the training manual that they all go through the training for? That's a way to fact check whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it kind of challenges that idea of that they're the all-knowing, expert.
One thing that I'm gonna give y'all, since y'all got the pens out, because this is fire. I'm just gonna tell y'all the secret, because I've been sitting on this for 5 years. So when you go into the police academy, it's like a college, right? It's like a college course. You guys remember when you go to college, right? You have to buy your own books, right? They have these textbooks and stuff. I'm gonna tell you a secret. How do you think a SWAT team in some small county learns how to SWAT? They have to learn it from from some place like Los Angeles PD, like, right? There's a virality to the best trades and practices. You have to teach people how to do stuff. And so there's almost textbooks on every single law enforcement topic. You want to know how to do arms trafficking, there's a textbook on it. You want to know how to learn how to get, and it's written from the perspective of, I'm a detective and I just came across my first meth case in so-and-so small town police department. When you get that, they will show you not only what paperwork exists, but what tools for investigation exist, what you should do, what you could do, and it's written in the perspective of how to catch the criminal. Meaning you know their intentions, their tactics, and all of that other stuff. And so when I look at like law enforcement, I'll give you another example, stereotyping law enforcement right now. California has a really great example of like, we have a lot of strict gun control laws. We have the California Department of Justice that has a gun retrieval task force. We have all these departments that go out here and, right, and they're like doing all these collection of guns and stuff. And so I'm gonna tell you a series of some badass stories that I've done. Police departments sell their own duty weapons by the thousands. And so I have tape of like Fort Worth Police Department doing gun buybacks, being like, we're trying to fight all this crime and stuff, and we're losing all these people, and the chief is out here saying, we're gonna go and get, we wanna give out vouchers to get these old revolvers and stuff like that. And they sold 1,100 Sig Sauer pistols back out to the public at a discount. And the ATF tells me, yes, these are showing up in crimes. In fact, in the state of Texas, I found in a 10-year period, they had sold almost 12,000 weapons. That's like enough to arm the Nicaraguan military. It's not an exaggeration. When we looked at, like I said, in a strong state like California, where a lot of these police departments are whining and crying about how they're doing so much about fighting gun crime, we looked at the ballistic software, right, to match traces on weapons, to clear innocent, it could clear, not only solve crimes, but it could actually absolve people, right, of guilt, and not even running it. Federal government spent millions of dollars on it. They asked for it, they don't even use it. And so when you hand the mic to them and they out here talking about we rolling out this program and we doing this, that, and the other, it's like, yeah, you're stereotyping them as James Bond, and these dudes are like, it's like Mayberry PD. It's not real.
Chris Payne, CBS 17, Raleigh, North Carolina. I got two comments, not really a question, but two comments. I know you had mentioned diversifying, newsrooms. I think it's also important, for companies to diversify corporate offices too. Yeah. Not only diversify that, diversify your advertisers, because bottom line is a lot of TV stations, you have a bottom line. And I don't care what, a lot of folks say, at the end of the day, companies are in it to make money. You have newsrooms who are out there trying to get stories, trying to cover the community, and the most important thing is to, represent your community that you're from. And to be able to do that, you have to be diversified. But if the boardrooms aren't diversified and they're saying, hey, you need to make X amount of dollars this year and you're getting this amount of staff, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So I think it's important for companies to recognize that and change that, to become a little bit more diversified. The other thing I would say too is, you brought up something and it made me think, so I'm in my 40s. So for me, one of my favorite basketball players of all time, I love Michael Jordan, but it's a guy by the name of Len Bias. And if you've never heard of Len Bias, I would say Google it. And the one thing that I would say is, when Len Bias was drafted #1 in the NBA draft by the Boston Celtics, he never played a stitch of NBA basketball because he passed away. I'm not even gonna say how he passed away. Google it if you don't know the story. But his death was directly responsible for some of the drug laws that went into effect in the late 80s when Ronald Reagan was in the White House. And those laws still, I think, impact society today. And it's, you look back on it and you talk about how many African Americans are in jail and this and that. And those laws, those drug laws that were put into place, I think had such a detrimental effect on society, and we're still suffering from that. So That's all I have to say.
No, I think those two statements are, I'm just going to co-sign on that. Yeah, I think that's why a lot of the stuff that I talk now about is kind of, when we look at this issue, that's why I had it in that slide, we got to start talking about high-level structural changes to get this right. And I think I've been confronted by a lot of newsrooms. It's like, oh, you're talking about shaking the boat too much and stuff like that. As if media is in a great place right now, right? We're getting beat up out here in front of the Capitol. I know homies who were there. And so we're at a point in time where the distrust of media is very, very low, just on a national, right? And I think we try to play it off and be like, oh, there's a part of society that we just can't get to. Or we could take responsibility and be like, yo, is the information we're providing as useful to the American public as it needs to be? And I'm kind of on the latter. I'm like, I look out here and I see an immense gap. When I see the problems in the American society, I see people having a national conversation and they're having it in the dark. And that's on us. It's on us to fill that gap. I look at people talking about gun violence and policing, and I actually don't say this is wrong or this is right. I actually am sad because I'm like, they just don't know the reality. We're sitting here in this room and we all know the reality. And I think we all know that as journalists. When we go out here, we eat breakfast with like the non-journo friends and stuff like that, and we're like, oh, we really know. But that weighs on me. That weighs on me, that knowledge, right? Because people are coming out here and they're having to vote and make decisions and stuff like that. And it's really, people are dying in that gap, right? And so that's why I'm just like so empowered to be like, we gotta fill that gap. Right? And the stuff that we're talking about here is filling that gap. When you go out and you say, hey, there's a traffic accident, there's an officer-involved shooting, you're not filling that gap, right? In fact, right, a lot of journalists are struggling and stuff like that because the reality is that social media and government entities right now can directly get messaging to the populace. So they don't really need us for that shorthand crap anymore, right? They can tweet out there's an accident, we got 4 trucks over here. They don't need us to show up and say that. What the world needs us to do is contextualize, because people are trying to figure out why they burning down stuff outside, right? People are trying to figure out what's going on. Even right now, white people who are like racist, right, are still like, two things. Study came out, found out that both left and right are just as concerned about mass shootings. They don't agree on what to do, but they're just as concerned, right? And the other thing is, post-George Floyd, even people who don't get it still get this, that there is a policing problem. Remember, Trump actually did criminal justice reform, right? And so this is a major problem, and we're kind of sitting around, and when you throw out like a little simplistic story, it's like you're kind of wasting your own time because you're not speaking to nothing. And this is why people are looking, like I said with that one slide, they're like, the stuff that's on TV is not matching my reality, so this must be entertainment. This must be Netflix. And so why should I contribute to that? Why should I invest in that? Why is this useful to me? And they're turning away. So yeah, we kind of gotta get better at that. Sorry, just a messenger.
Hi, I'm Casey Clark. I'm news director in Charlotte and a native of Baltimore, so I cried the day Len Bias died. Research question. Over the last 15 years, especially metro police departments have had more difficulty hiring. Tim Tunison from WBAL can back me up on this. There was a time about 10 years ago, Baltimore City Police were so tired of getting hammered for having 800 openings, they simply lowered their personnel. Instead of having 3,200 cops, one day they just simply had 2,400, and that was fully staffed. As the standards have come down, it used to be you had to have a college degree, and you couldn't have committed a felony or a major misdemeanor to be considered, and you had to go through a psychological background check. Now, you don't have to have a college degree, you can have a GED, and you can have a felony in your past and become a cop. Is there any research being done as to the quality of the police department, the background of the people that are now joining the police department, and the number of incidents tied to those departments? Because I'm concerned that the quality of professional law enforcement has gone down over the last 20 years precipitously. And because they're having to lower their standards, we as a society are paying for it. So I'd like you to answer that. And by the way, if you want to address mass shootings,
You got research on that?
I don't
I
have
will
research on that, but I
say
have something to say about it.
that There's a brilliant man from Greensboro over there who should take credit for this idea, but why are we so afraid to take the heat from the public to one time show a child that was shot in a mass shooting? You want to change the conversation around school shootings. Show one child that's been shot, and this entire country will come to a grinding halt, and we'll get on it and change it. But right now we have sterilized it to the point where it's just crime tape and people hugging each other, and that's horseshit, because it's not going to get fixed until people feel it. Thanks.
So, I'm not sure that I'm not sure, I don't personally know of research related to the hiring problem with police departments. Although I think that it would be really worthwhile to dig into that. I'm not sure that you could directly tie like a shift in a requirement such as, college degree versus a GED, or even a criminal background. I mean, I would be careful about that. And the reason I would be careful about that is we have over-incarcerated Black people in this country for a lot of reasons and a lot of laws that have now shifted. And so if you say, oh, you can't have a misdemeanor or you can't have a felony, you're effectively precluding the diversification of police forces. So I'm not sure that that's the right metric, is all I'm saying. I mean, not that it shouldn't be studied. I think it should be studied. I think that's a great idea. But I'm not sure that using that metric as, hey, that means that the quality of the police force has gone down, is not necessarily the right metric.
And I'd like to add to that, because this is a very interesting kind of story that's occurred a little bit before 9/11. So in the late 1990s, right, there was a lot of essentially corrupt police departments were finding, or these corrupt police units were kind of coming to prominence, right? So we had Rampart Division, I think we had one in New Orleans, where you would see like entire drug divisions, right, dealing drugs and just doing all this rampant corruption. And the FBI was getting involved in stuff like that. And so police, right, one of the things, because we've allowed police, again, to be the monopoly on criminal justice, and we're gonna put a little pin in this real quick, because one of the problems is that since they're the monopoly on criminal justice, we let them solve their own problems. Right? We're like, hey, what do you think y'all would do to stop doing this? And they're like, maybe we'll do body cameras, and it don't work, right? We get to let them pick their own punishments. But so going back to this, we're like, hey, there's a lot of corrupt police units coming up. Like, you as police departments, what can you do to stop this? So a lot of departments said, you know what, there's no such thing. It's impossible for a police officer to become corrupt, right? They must have been corrupt from the first place. And so then they started adding in all of these types of, okay, we're gonna have to do polygraph tests, right? So for me to become a cop, I had to do 2 just to get in the academy. They're not admissible in law, but whatever. And so they started adding all these types of loopholes, right? Where you ever associate it to someone who's a criminal. You can see how this starts becoming problematic, right? Because it's like, do you live next to a criminal? Do you have debt, right? Because if you have debt, you could be liable for a bribe, right? So they start adding all of these things, thinking that they're going to protect, right, the integrity of an officer as they entered into the police department. What this did is that it started eliminating people who were probably the most tied into the community, who probably had the most street experience, the people who probably knew the most. And so eventually, when you have a city like Baltimore, or you have a city like Houston or Dallas or something like that, if you have all of this criteria, you've eliminated the population in the city from being, right, a cop. And so what you had to do is you had to import, just gonna keep it real, white boys from the suburbs that never seen anything. They're the only ones that can kind of jump through all those hoops. But then you have these people who are policing an unfamiliar community, and they are now armed with reasonable suspicion. And the way that works as a police officer is, right, if a reasonable person believes that you're suspicious, I can go ahead and start making police activity, right, police contact with you. I remember when I was in the police academy, we were running a scenario, and the scenario was this. Someone was standing in a Walmart parking lot after it closed. I'm not trying to brag about myself, but about 4 officers, and I was one of them included, were the only ones who just didn't do anything about it. Because we had lived in a community where people wait for their rides after work. But all the other officers, right, because they had come from the suburbs, they had come from these other communities, that was abnormal to them. And under the guise of law, under the way the law works, they had every reason to stop and interact with that person as suspicious. But here's the thing, they're policing in a community in which they're not from. So what they thought was suspicious isn't suspicious in that community, it's not abnormal in that community, right? And so what happens, and we can look at this, you look at the number of officers who work within the communities, right, that they live in, and they're not there.
That's a huge challenge in California in particular. I mean, in the Bay Area where housing affordability is so challenging, many officers live 1 to 2 hours away from the communities in which they serve.
Right.
And so like that brings its own set of challenges and is certainly worth studying.
And so it got a little bit worse because on top of this, they did have a major deficit that police departments did have to step into. And so these officers, right, even though that they were clean, they were not street smart. This is a major problem, right? So how do you eliminate that gap, right, where they're not street savvy, they can be taken advantage, right? And so they said, we'll fill the gap with equipment and training. And that is when the militarization started coming in. A little bit before 9/11, we're like, listen, how do we get these naive white guys from the suburbs to not get killed in inner city Baltimore? Plate armor, AR-15s, bug-out bags, and about 30 or 40 more hours behind the gun. We will move them more aggressively. We will take that's when we start moving to that moment that it was like, it don't matter unless we get home, right? And that's how we started kind of interacting that way. We use tactics to kind of fill the patch of ignorance.
Well, I'll tell you one other thing. This is a little off topic, but I'm going to jump in anyway. It's like when you were thinking about doing research on police agencies and what they're doing, I actually do work with a professor at Stanford, Tom D., who's doing some research right now, taking a look at what happens with crisis intervention training. So many officers are mandated to take crisis intervention training. They're listed as having crisis intervention training. You'll read their incident reports and they'll say, having gone through, and they'll list, it's like a boilerplate, crisis intervention training, I then undertook these steps. It's all very kind of stilted language, and they'll say whatever it was they did. But in fact, if you look at the body camera footage and the other details of what actually happened in those incidents, the crisis intervention training just goes out the window in a crisis. Like they don't follow it.
Walter Smith Randolph, Connecticut Public Investigative Editor. I just want your perspective on how newsrooms cover line of duty deaths, because when I've worked in local TV newsrooms, it's wall-to-wall coverage, you cancel whatever it is, you carry the funeral. I've been in the newsroom where I was told, can you wear a blue tie while you cover the death? Which is like, thin blue line, Blue Lives Matter, and this is like before George Floyd, and I knew what the blue meant. So I'm just wondering, as a former police officer, as a journalist, how do you cover, does it need to change? What do you think?
Okay, so I'll go back to, again, I'm gonna go back to a sociologist I'm friends with, Michael Sierra Ravelo, and this is actually how I found him. So one of the things is that officers do have on-the-line duty deaths. But one of the things that we have found is that within even police systems, right, even within police culture, there is a tendency to overemphasize on-duty deaths, particularly ones that involve, actions such as crime or shootings or something like that. One is that it builds a natural esprit de corps, right? Which is what happens in almost every profession. It happens here with us as journalists. But it's a little bit more complex in law enforcement because of where they stand in society. I want to remind everyone this, right? And I think this kind of just goes out in the air. Law enforcement is the only government entity that is able to take life and liberty domestically. The military can't do that. So if it seems like I'm super hard on them, it's because the stakes are so high. It's a very delicate and dangerous job, right? And I mean that for all of society. Like if they mess up, people die. We die, they die, everyone dies. It's just a very tight thing. But with that being said, there's a tendency for them to overemphasize their on-duty deaths. The majority of officers die from heart disease and car accidents, right? But there is a tendency, again, for them to advocate on themselves because it's a very excellent vehicle for them to get officer safety funding. If you actually look at gun laws and stuff like that, a lot of our armor-piercing ammunition laws had nothing to do with about protecting all of us, right, who get killed by guns way more. The bills are all signed off as cop killer round laws, right? And so I almost take a public health position from this, which is I am here to, again, report for the community, report for the masses that are most affected like this. As a police officer, I'm a special interest individual. And on a grander scale of just policy-wise, it is problematic in any country when you have a group of armed men who believe that because of their status of being armed and with the government, that they are a special interest voting bloc, that they almost think they're a race. Blue lives, it don't matter, it's a job. And this has become very dangerous, period. If you actually look at the reason why it's blue lines and just going back historically, modern policing came from the Troubles in Ireland. It came from the British military had to figure out a somewhat blunted instrument to corral and control essentially Irish rebellion. And every time they would send out the military, right, they would end up just taking so much violence that it would actually spark more riots and rebellions. So they had to create a force, right, that was not like the military. And so they didn't want any confusion. So what did the British military wear at the time? They wore the color red. And so they're like, to make sure that this force, right, is not confused for the military, we will make them wear the opposite, blue. That's where the color blue comes from. That's where all that stuff comes from. And so blue is supposed to be a distinguishing mark from essentially their distance from militarization. You see how this is kind of messed up right now? Yet right now, our officers look very military, right? And so that's why they wear blue. It's supposed to set them apart from military armed guys. And so now that we've moved into the status over the last 20 years, I find it very odd that we have a hyper-powerful sect of the government that thinks of themselves as an exclusive voting bloc that's distant away from the American public. And so when it comes to their deaths, I guess, in the short way of it, I mean, I contextualize it just as I would contextualize any other government person that died. And if it doesn't have a context that would inform the public about what will help them, it's not going to hit my news. Just hard like that, I'm sorry.
I do. I think it's a case by case. Like it depends on what what happened. I was in the Seattle Times. I was the only person in the Seattle Times newsroom when a gunman walked into a coffee shop and killed 4 police officers. I can't remember the year, 2010, I think. And that was a huge story for us, right? That was huge. It affected the community. It was, the entire newsroom worked on that story. And there was a 30-hour manhunt for the shooter. So, that's the kind of story that we needed to do that with. If it's something else where it's, less dramatic, less whatever, an outlier, maybe not quite so much coverage. The other thing, though, is that kind of coverage shouldn't stop us from still doing our job as journalists. So one of the things that happened in that 30-hour manhunt was that the police went to the house of a relative of this shooter and tore it apart. There was no, tear gas, destroyed things, ran through windows, all the woman who owned the house ended up having to get it detoxed because of all the tear gas that had been, set off in there. And the guy was not there. He wasn't there. There was no, he had maybe gotten close to there, but then she basically called the police herself, I think, if I can recall back correctly, and said, I'm not letting him in. And yeah, he's I can't remember if it was a third cousin or some kind of cousin or nephew or something. And there was no reason for the police to think that he was barricading himself there. And yet that's what they did. And so that was a big part of the story. So you don't want to get onto the idea of wearing the blue tie. You don't want to get into the perspective of that you're on the side of a particular entity, regardless of what or who that entity or person is. I mean, I think you need to cover the news, but in context.
Yeah, I mean, and I've covered a lot of shootings. In fact, I just did a major story right now where Houston officers, got shot in broad daylight with converted Glock turned into a machine gun. But I think the focus on the story was, hey, people of the community, don't get shot with a converted Glock turned into a machine gun. This is out here. And so, again, I think it's a very delicate line. And I think, I've been in those shoes, right? I've been in all these shoes. I'm not saying I've done all this stuff. I've totally messed up. And me as a former cop is the main one that they will pull me in and be like, you get it, man, you get it. And I've been there at the funerals and stuff. And yeah, but I think you just have to remind yourself, that I am here for the community. And you have to act, it's a brutal system. And that's why I speak so brutally about it. And it's just like, would these people show up, with your favorite colored tie at your funeral? No. And so it's like, I kind of keep that perspective that I'm here, to speak to the lowest common denominator of society. And that is not the police. That is hardly ever the police. I'm here to speak truth to power. I'm not here to, that means I'm speaking it from the bottom up. I'm not speaking it from the second floor to the third, And so I'm here for the lowest common denominator.
I wish we could take questions for the rest of the day, but we've got a little bit of group work, but please join me in thanking these two.